Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into a really specific and honestly highly controversial hypothesis from our recent source material. These sources are suggesting that the entire narrative we're being fed about extraterrestrial life, well, it might just be a meticulously crafted deception. We're going to look at a theory that literally bridges ancient theology, modern physics, and mainstream media to propose an entirely different reality. So let's get into it.
Now, the core question our sources are posing here is absolutely wild to think about. What if the current media push for alien disclosure is actually just masking a much darker interdimensional reality? The data we're looking at today argues that we aren't being prepped for first contact with, space brothers from another galaxy. Instead, it suggests we're being primed for a massive, ancient spiritual deception. The claim is that what we're calling aliens are actually something way more sinister, and they've been right here all along.
Section 1. The modern disclosure narrative. We're going to start our journey by just looking at the tip of the iceberg here.
We're looking at how popular media, like the conceptual indie film Disclosure Day, is framing this whole thing for the public right now. Our source material spends a lot of time analyzing Hollywood's take on the phenomenon, and the trend they identify is pretty undeniable. There's this concerted effort to completely normalize these entities. The sources point out a really disturbing shift where extraterrestrials are increasingly portrayed as these benevolent saviors, right? And humans? Well, we're suddenly the bad guys. Think about it for a second. The data highlights how recent movies completely gloss over the horrific realities reported by actual alleged abductees. The sheer terror, the paralysis, the sterile tables, all of that is just swept under the rug. Instead, the narrative is totally spun. It suggests they're just here to guide us, fix our broken planet, or upgrade our DNA. And in doing so, it effectively silences the actual trauma of the people who claim to have survived these encounters.
Section 2. Extraterrestrial versus interdimensional. So if these entities aren't benevolent scientists from some distant star system, what exactly are they?
The source material lays out a massive core conflict here. They argue that these beings aren't crossing galaxies in physical, nuts-and-bolts spaceships. Instead, they're ancient, deceptive, interdimensional entities. The data actually maps this directly back to ancient biblical texts, describing them as fallen angels or demonic entities. So they aren't flying through the vacuum of space, they're stepping through portals. The hypothesis is that they operate in a parallel reality, what the source calls the second heaven, and they just sort of bleed over into our physical world occasionally.
And this brings us to how they supposedly pull this off. The sources hypothesize that abductions actually happen within what they call a dimensional bubble. And honestly, this would explain why victims report crazy things like floating right through solid closed windows or experiencing this sudden, absolute dead silence. One account in the data describes the terrifying physical sensation of this shift perfectly. They said it felt like their body was suddenly made of ball bearings, accompanied by this low, intense vibrational hum. Once you're pulled inside this bubble, you are completely isolated outside of normal space and time. And according to the sources, that is exactly how these beings bypass physical barriers like walls and locked doors.
Section 3. Tactics of the phenomenon. So, how exactly do they interact with us?
The crucial point the sources make here is that these entities rely heavily on deception. They are master manipulators. They don't show up with transparency, they show up wearing camouflage. To hide their true, terrifying forms and bypass our natural defenses, the source claims they implant what are known as screen memories. This is especially true when they target vulnerable people, like children. The data is just packed with examples of this psychological trickery. An entity might project the image of a giant owl, a friendly stray dog, or even a deceased family member right into the victim's mind. It's a localized delusion, custom designed to trick the human brain into compliance and suppress the absolute panic that seeing their true form would instantly cause.
The sources pose a really brilliant rhetorical question here. If these beings are truly benevolent, why do their methods look exactly like kidnapping and psychological abuse? Why do they refuse to offer any real, tangible help? Seriously, why travel millions of light years across the universe just to pull a terrified 6-year-old out of bed at 3 a.m.? Why not just land on the White House lawn in broad daylight and hand over the cure for cancer? The data argues that this whole cat-and-mouse game proves their intentions are entirely nefarious. They operate in the shadows for a reason, because their ultimate goals require human consent and massive deception.
Section 4. Ancient texts and technology. To truly grasp what's happening today, the source argues we actually need to look thousands of years into the past.
Let's look at how the data maps ancient scriptures to modern encounters. The proposition here is that historical prophets were actually witnessing highly advanced interdimensional technology, stuff we now just call UFOs. when ancient texts talk about chariots of fire or wheels within wheels, the hypothesis is that they were trying to describe localized manipulation of space-time, crafts just blinking in and out of reality. And what about a flaming sword turning every which way, guarding a gate? The source suggests this is literally a description of ancient energy weapon technology acting as a high-tech barrier to protect a dimensional access point. Mind-blowing, right?
The foundational theory driving all of this is what the sources refer to as the Genesis 3:15 seed war. This hypothesis suggests that the ultimate grand goal of these entities is the corruption and harvesting of human genetics and, ultimately, human souls. According to the source material, this isn't some new, modern phenomenon. Not at all. It's the continuation of a millennial-old conflict where these fallen entities are actively trying to mingle their seed, their genetics, with humanity. The goal? To create hybrid beings that can infiltrate and eventually overthrow human dominion on Earth.
And the timing of all this? The source points to this incredibly chilling 100-year cycle. They warn that the timeline of modern disclosure is escalating toward a massive, predicted event. The data actually connects the famous 1917 Marian apparitions in Fatima, where thousands of people describe seeing a dull silver disk in the sky, directly to the 2017 mainstream media drop of the UAP footage by the government. The source firmly believes we are rapidly approaching the climax of this timeline, potentially right around the year 2027, where they claim the veil is finally going to be fully lifted.
Section 5. Predictive Programming in Media. Which brings us to how the public is supposedly being primed for all of this right under our noses.
The source material argues we are being actively conditioned through mainstream entertainment. They call it predictive programming. This idea that media is deliberately used to subconsciously prep the masses for future engineered events. A huge example the source specifically highlights is that recent Martin Scorsese Super Bowl ad, "Hello Down There." They claim it's textbook predictive programming designed to condition literally billions of people to react to a global UFO arrival with awe instead of sheer panic. In the commercial, massive flying saucers just appear over major cities like New York and Paris, and the key takeaway from the source? Look at the faces of the people in the ad. Nobody is screaming, nobody is running for their lives. They're all looking up with smiles, totally accepting these entities as benevolent visitors.
According to the source material, this is the exact playbook for predictive programming. It's used to prime our collective consciousness for an impending staged intervention. Step 1, you introduce the concept as a fun sci-fi trope. Step 2, you leak vague government footage to normalize the idea that something is out there. Step 3, you use blockbuster movies and massive ad campaigns to portray these beings as our saviors. And finally, Step 4, you just sit back and wait for the perfect global crisis to reveal them to a totally desperate world.
Section 6. The Great Deception Endgame. So, what is the ultimate goal of all this manipulation, the screen memories, the media programming? Why go through the trouble of a decades-long psychological operation?
The source warns of an absolutely terrifying endgame. They hypothesize that these entities are simply waiting for a moment of peak global terror. Think a nuclear threat or a World War III scenario. When humanity is at its absolute breaking point, that's when they'll appear as our saviors. They won't come down firing lasers like in the movies. They'll come offering world peace, limitless zero-point energy, and the cure for radiation. But here's the catch. The source claims the cost of this miraculous intervention will be our absolute submission. It's a trade, advanced tech for human souls. This, they argue, will spark a massive spiritual apostasy, where millions of people just willingly abandon their faith to worship these beings.
And this brings us to the absolute crux of their entire theory. Why do they need us to submit? Because, while these entities can manipulate matter, clone physical bodies, and completely hack our DNA, they are spiritually bankrupt. The source argues they desperately lack the one incredible thing humanity inherently possesses: a soul. They literally cannot create one, so they need humans to willingly trade, surrender, or grant permission over their spiritual essence.
The data gets even more specific, claiming these dark forces are actually outnumbered 2-to-1 in the spiritual realm. And that right there is exactly why they are so desperately accelerating this grand deception. Drawing back on those ancient texts, the hypothesis states that when the original angelic rebellion happened, 1/3 fell, leaving 2/3 loyal. So to win this cosmic interdimensional war, these fallen entities are using Earth as a massive recruitment ground. They are trying to siphon human souls to bolster their ranks before some final, ultimate confrontation.
So, the final thought I really want to leave you with today is this. If the source material is right, are we actually preparing for first contact with a new species? Or are we walking blindfolded into the greatest spiritual trap in human history? The data heavily suggests that we are all just sitting in a giant global theater, And this entire disclosure narrative, it's a highly produced script. When those ships finally uncloak and the curtain pulls back, will you see benevolent space brothers coming to save us? Or will you recognize the ancient deception staring right back at you? Thank you so much for exploring this explainer with us. Keep your eyes open, stay curious, and always question the narrative.